1987, in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Baltimore. The air was crisp, and the trees were skeletal against the twilight sky. The Halloween night has always been a time for frights, tricks, and ghoulish delight, but for some, it's also a night of true terror. An evening when the boundary between the living and the dead thins, and the things that go bump in the night come a little too close. D. Urson family, James, his wife, Linda, and their 2 children. Marcus and Emily were ready to celebrate Halloween. The house was decked out in cobwebs, glowing pumpkins lined the driveway, and a scarecrow stood sentinel by the front door. The Andersons had moved into the neighborhood just a few months prior. Their new home was an old, stately Victorian manor, the kind that creaked and groaned at night. It had been on the market for years, rumored to be haunted, but the Andersons didn't believe in such things. To them, it was just a house, and tonight was just another Halloween. Emily, at 8 years old, was dressed as a witch, complete with a crooked black hat, while Marcus, 12, had opted for a skeleton costume. They had been buzzing with excitement all day, eager to go trick-or-treating and collect as much candy as possible. But something about this Halloween was different. Something was off. Linda had felt it first, a strange sense of unease, as if they were being watched. But she dismissed it as nerves. After all, they were new in town, and Halloween was always a little eerie. As darkness fell and the first trick-or-treaters arrived, Linda and James sat on the porch, handing out candy. The kids were out with their friends, running from house to house. Everything seemed normal until an old man, wearing a tattered, moth-eaten cloak, approached their porch. His face was obscured by a porcelain mask, its surface cracked and yellowed with age. His movements were stiff, almost puppet-like. "Trick or treat," the old man rasped, his voice a low, unsettling whisper. Linda reached for a handful of candy, but James grabbed her arm, halting her. "That's an adult," James muttered under his breath. "This is for kids." The old man remained silent, staring at them through the mask, his empty eyes reflecting the dim light of the porch lantern. After a few uncomfortable moments, Linda dropped the candy into his outstretched hand, just to get rid of him. Without a word, the man turned and shuffled down the driveway, vanishing into the night. James and Linda exchanged uneasy glances. The encounter left them with a lingering sense of dread, but they tried to shake it off. It was Halloween, after all. Creepy was part of the deal. Hours passed, and the flow of trick-or-treaters began to slow. Marcus and Emily hadn't returned yet, but Linda wasn't worried. She knew they were having fun and would be back soon. Then, at around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. James opened the door, expecting to see more children in costumes, but what he found instead made his blood run cold. There, standing on the porch, were Marcus and Emily, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror, but they weren't alone. Behind them, looming like a shadow, was the old man in the cracked porcelain mask. "Dad," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. "We couldn't lose him." James pulled his children inside, slamming the door behind them. But when he turned to look through the peephole, the old man was gone, vanished into the night like a phantom. Linda rushed to their side, wrapping her arms around the children. "What happened? What do you mean you couldn't lose him?" Emily, her voice barely above a whisper, spoke first. He followed us, Mom, from the moment we left the house. We didn't know he was there at first, but we kept seeing him just standing there, watching us from the corner of every street." Marcus nodded, his hands shaking. "We tried running, but no matter how fast we went or how far we got, he was always there. We saw him outside almost every house." Linda's heart raced. "But he didn't do anything? He didn't try to grab you or hurt you?" Both children shook their heads. "No," Marcus said. "He just followed us." James grabbed the phone to call the police, but as he dialed, the lights in the house flickered. Then, with a low hum, the power went out, plunging the entire neighborhood into darkness. The only light came from the jack-o'-lanterns outside, their carved faces glowing ominously through the windows. "We need to check the breaker," James said, trying to stay calm. "It's probably just a power surge." But as he moved toward the basement door, there was a loud knock on the front door. 3 slow, deliberate bangs that echoed through the house. Linda froze, holding the children tight. "Don't open it," Marcus whispered. "It's him." James hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. His breath caught in his throat. The old man was back, standing at the foot of the porch steps, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a line of figures, each one wearing an identical porcelain mask. Some were short, like children, others were tall and hunched. Their masks were cracked, yellowed, and chipped. But they all stared directly at the house. James stumbled back from the door. "There's more of them." Linda rushed to the window and peeked through the curtain. The street outside was filled with them, dozens, maybe hundreds of masked figures, all standing in eerie silence, facing the house. "What do they want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're leaving," James said, his voice tight with fear. He grabbed the car keys and ushered his family toward the back door. They would make a run for the car, drive until they found help. But as soon as they opened the back door, they were greeted by more of the masked figures, standing in a perfect line at the edge of the yard. Panic set in. There was no way out. Every exit was blocked by the silent, staring figures. Linda held the children close, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do we do?" James shook his head, his mind racing for a solution. But there was none. They were trapped. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the masked figures began to move. Slowly, mechanically, they turned away from the house, one by one disappearing into the shadows. Within moments they were gone, leaving the Andersons standing in stunned silence. The power flickered back on, the lights returning to their warm glow. The house was quiet again, the street outside empty, but the Andersons never felt safe in that house again. They never saw the masked figures after that night, but the memory haunted them forever. Some say the house was cursed, that the spirits of those who had died there long ago still lingered, wearing the cracked porcelain masks of forgotten souls. Others believe it was just a strange, unexplained Halloween prank. But the Andersons knew better. They knew that on Halloween night some things, some nightmares are all too real. And they never forgot the eyes behind those masks. The Forgotten Masks, Part 2. The Andersons barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the trees outside made them jump. Linda kept the kids in their room where they huddled together, terrified to close their eyes. James stayed awake, pacing the hallway, checking the windows for any sign of the masked figures. But the street outside remained quiet, unnervingly normal, as if nothing had ever happened. The next morning, the family sat together at the kitchen table. No one spoke. The events of the previous night hung over them like a dark cloud, but they were all too afraid to bring it up. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "What were they, Dad?" James shook his head, rubbing his tired eyes. "I don't know, Marcus, I really don't. Maybe it was some kind of prank. People around here like to scare the new folks on Halloween. That's all it was." But Marcus wasn't convinced, and neither was Emily. They had felt something last night, something more than just fear. It was like those masked figures weren't just watching them, they were waiting for something. Linda looked down at her hands, still shaking from the memory. "We need to tell someone. The police, the neighbors. Someone has to know what's going on." James nodded reluctantly. He didn't want to admit that he was just as scared as his children, but something about the whole thing gnawed at him. Who were those people? Why had they followed Marcus and Emily, only to show up at the house later? Later that afternoon, James and Linda decided to talk to the neighbors, starting with the elderly woman who lived next door. Mrs. Harper had lived in the neighborhood for decades, and if anyone knew anything about strange happenings, it would be her. Mrs. Harper greeted them warmly, but her face paled when they mentioned the masked figures. You saw them?" she asked, her voice trembling. Linda exchanged a glance with James. "Yes, last night. Do you know what they are?" Mrs. Harper took a deep breath and invited them inside, her hands wringing nervously. "I hoped that story had died with the last family that lived in your house. But I suppose these things never truly go away." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Harper sat them down in her living room, her voice low as she began to tell the tale. "Your house isn't just old, it's cursed. There was a family that lived there many years ago, the Holloways. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, just like you. Every year on Halloween, they would host a masquerade ball. It became quite famous around here. People from all over would come in their finest clothes, wearing the most beautiful, elaborate masks." Her eyes grew distant, as if remembering something painful. "But one Halloween, There was an accident. No one really knows what happened, but the story goes that a fire broke out in the middle of the party. The house was filled with smoke, and in the chaos people panicked. The Holloways tried to save their children, but they were trapped upstairs. By the time the fire was put out, it was too late. The children were gone. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's horrible. Mrs. Harper nodded, her face grim. The house was rebuilt, of course, but after that night, strange things started happening. People began seeing figures in masks, porcelain masks, just like the ones worn at the Holloways' last masquerade. They would appear in the street, on Halloween night, watching the house, sometimes even following people. It's said that the spirits of the Holloways and their guests are still trapped, wearing those same masks, unable to move on. James swallowed hard. But why us? We don't have anything to do with them. Mrs. Harper looked at him with sad eyes. Because you're in their house now. Every family that has lived there has been visited by the masked figures. Some say the spirits are looking for the children they lost, while others believe they're waiting for someone to help them find peace. Linda felt her stomach turn. What happened to the other families? Mrs. Harper hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Most of them left soon after. The house drives people away eventually. I'm sorry to say this, but if they've come to you, they won't stop. James stood up abruptly, the anxiety building in his chest. We'll move. We'll get out of there. We're not staying in a haunted house. Mrs. Harper shook her head. It's not that simple, James. The house, it has a way of keeping people. You can leave, but the spirits might follow you. It's like they're bound to anyone who sets foot inside. Linda's hands trembled as she spoke. So what do we do? How do we get rid of them? Mrs. Harper sighed. There are stories, legends really, about how to put the spirits to rest. Some say that if you can find the masks, the real masks from that night, and destroy them, the spirits will be freed. Others say you need to hold a proper masquerade in the house, a party where the spirits can finally say goodbye. But no one's ever tried. Most people are too scared to face them. As the Andersons left Mrs. Harper's house, the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The idea of staying in the house was unbearable, but the thought of those masked figures following them wherever they went was even worse. That night, after putting the kids to bed, James and Linda sat in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. What do you think we should do? Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James stared into the flames, his mind racing. We have to try something. We can't live like this, waiting for them to show up again. I think we need to find those masks. If there's even a chance it could help. Linda nodded, though fear gripped her. But how do we find them? If they even still exist. As they sat in the eerie quiet of their home, a loud knock echoed through the house. Both of them froze, their hearts pounding in unison. The knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate bangs, just like the night before. Linda grabbed James's hand. Don't open it. But James already knew what was waiting on the other side. He stood slowly, walking toward the door with a sinking feeling in his chest. Through the peephole he saw them again, dozens of figures, all wearing the same cracked, yellowed porcelain masks. They stared up at the house in eerie silence, waiting. And this time, James knew they wouldn't leave so easily.